Sometimes I ask my Patreon for video suggestions, video ideas, and usually when I do that, I'll get movie recommendations for me to watch and review, which is to be expected. And then sometimes they throw a curveball at me. This is gonna signal the incels to my comment section again, isn't it? Good. I was gagged when I saw this request because at first glance, I felt like I could either answer it just very quickly with like one word, like yes, it's possible, or I'd have to talk about it at length and in depth and really get into it. Obviously I chose the latter. Like any good essay, let's start with a definition, a good working definition of the male gaze. The male gaze refers to the way women are objectified by the camera lens in Hollywood movies because men are in control of the production process and make decisions that appeal to their own values and interests. The audience, including women, are then positioned to accept this narrow representation. So let's take Coralie Farjah's movies one by one, starting with her feature directorial debut, Revenge. And starting just from the very opening of this movie, it immediately plays on our expectations of what the male gaze is. The opening shots are first of this desert landscape as we see a helicopter approaching in the distance. We cut to a similar shot of the desert, but it's reflected in the glasses of Richard, who takes up most of the frame. Literally the male gaze. As the camera pulls away slightly, we see Jen out of focus over his shoulder in the background, and she's suggestively licking a lollipop. So immediately when this movie starts, we've set up this idea of Jen through a man's eyes, literally like his focal point is taking up the majority of the camera frame. As Jen gets out of the helicopter, her legs are the focus as the camera kind of pans up her body. The super warm color palette evokes like the infamous Megan Fox a la Transformers type of shot where you know exactly what the point of introducing this character is, to sexualize them. And the rest of the first act frames Jen precisely by the male gaze textbook, cutting her body into fragments within the frame as Richard and his friends stare on. It's all intentional. Farjah is telling the audience that the male gaze has real-world harmful implications because we know eventually what is going to happen to Jen based on how Dimitri and Stan in particular are acting towards her. So we know we're inevitably coming to this conclusion where Stan rapes Jen. It happens off camera, which is already subverting what we know about these types of movies, especially within the patriarchy and the male gaze. I don't have enough fingers and toes to count how many overly long, to the point where it's like almost fetishy and exploitative rape scenes that I've seen in movies. So already the fact that this happens off camera, we've already subverted the male gaze. But it doesn't remove the power from the scene because we hear Jen's screams for help as Dimitri leaves and goes to the other room and turns on the TV to drown her out. And Farjah's disgust for these type of men is shown in a close-up of Dimitri when he kind of walks in on Stan and he's eating a candy bar while he looks at Jen looking at him, like pleading for help, pleading for him to do anything, showing that even in this state, she is still a spectacle for him and the audience. With Stan and Dimitri, it's them agreeing that this is what Jen gets for existing in front of them, and us as the audience being implicated in this because we recognize what is going to happen to Jen based on the previous scenes. And what I really love about this movie is the camera work and the editing later on. So after Jen takes the drugs, so she is able to like psych herself up to like patch herself up. And I just want to make a quick note about this part. I'm no doctor. I do reckon we're being asked to suspend our disbelief a bit with how she cauterizes her massive wound in her abdomen. It feels like a nod to the rape revenge genre as a whole, like how the women are always shown as like these phoenixes, like rising from the ashes of this horrible fucking thing that happened to them to exact revenge. And Farjah leans into that. Jen is truly an avenging force in this movie. But after this, we see her arm herself and leave the cave to kind of like scope out her next move. So she approaches this cliff and the camera circles her body from the feet up, and the camera like kind of doing a close-up of a woman's body from the feet up and kind of glazing over them is a common male gaze move. But in this instance, we see all of the dirt, the grime, the sweat, the blood covering her before the camera finally lands on her face, and she's fucking pissed. Like, technically speaking, it's very similar to how we were introduced to Jen with the way the camera moves and the way the camera frames her, but the vibe is already completely different. So Jen is looking through the binoculars at this cliff trying to find her last two targets, and in this moment the gaze flips from Richard and Stan's and Dimitri's to Jen's, with the men being the victims. This culminates in Jen taking out Stan, who, when we see him again facing off with Jen, he's now more fearful, crying, sniveling. And the ultimate flip of the script is with Richard, who assumes the role of every woman in a horror movie ever. So after everything that's happened, he goes back to his house, he strips naked and goes to take a shower, and that's when the slasher attacks. And we all know how that ends for Richard. In the end, we get one more camera pan up Jen's body. This time she is completely covered in Richard's blood before she turns and looks directly into camera, addressing the audience and holding us accountable for what we just saw. By playing with the conventions of rape revenge movies and the male gaze, Farja is asking the audience to be culpable for consuming this kind of media and recognizing how that bleeds into real life. And all of this said, and I still haven't even gotten to the substance. The substance is the ultimate satirization of the male gaze, as the entire movie is about how the male gaze affects non-male bodies. And that's not to say that the male gaze doesn't affect male bodies. It absolutely does. That's a discussion for a different video. We have Elizabeth Sparkle, who has literally made a name for herself, being the picture of everything the male gaze finds valuable. She looks beautiful, hot body, doesn't spout any feminist nonsense at them. The dream woman. So when that's taken away from her, she has been so programmed by this system that she turns to the substance to get that back. I mean, the whole movie is about this very topic, so I'm not gonna recount every single scene for you guys. And it came out recently. Everyone's been talking about it and rewatching it with the Oscars. So I'm just gonna point out a few specific moments. The first being because I love this scene so much. It's the bit where Dennis Quaid's character is essentially firing Elizabeth Sparkle, but not before he mansplains like why he's doing it to her. He's, you know, explaining to her that's just what the people want. They want somebody younger, fresh. So while he's explaining all of this to her, he is simultaneously being the most disgusting person in the room. The close-ups of him eating the shrimp, which feels like a nod to Dimitri in Revenge with the candy bar. And it just drives home that in this patriarchal system, within the male gaze, men are allowed to be multifaceted like this. Men are allowed to be disgusting. They're allowed to be loud. This character is allowed to remain in his position, hold all of his power despite his age and despite how disgusting he's behaving. But Elizabeth is not allowed to because she's a woman. The pump it up scene is another perfect, if not most obvious example of this, with its hyper stylized editing, close-up of Sue's body, and the expression on her face, which is really important during this moment, as it's very suggestive facial expressions. It's like night and day compared to Elizabeth's workout clip from the beginning of the movie, where the camera doesn't really get too close to her. Her body is like slightly more covered up than Sue's pink outfit. So when we see the pump it up scene, we can then recognize that even before we know that Elizabeth is going to get fired, when we see that workout scene from the beginning, we already know that the camera and therefore society is treating her differently because of her age. And then there's the reveal of Elizabeth's body after Sue has been abusing the balance of the substance for a while. She's this grotesque monster, and this is even before we get to Alyssa Sue. It's just wrinkles and spots everywhere. Her boobs are hanging comically low to the point where you know this is hyperbole, like this is satire. It's something straight out of the male gaze's nightmare. The way older femme bodies are treated in cinema is reflected in how we as the audience are meant to react to Elizabeth in this moment. horror and disgust. And we see this more literally when Alyssa Sue goes to the New Year's Eve show and the audience reacts to her as if she's just revealed King Kong behind her and he's broken out of his restraints. So the audience in that moment is how us, the audience in the theater, is supposed to be reacting. And Farjah is, again, asking us to question our participation in this system. All right, so I've said a lot of words now, so let's readdress the prompt. Is it possible to subvert the male gaze a la Coralie Farjah? And I think it's like both in a way, because I think what the prompt is asking is, can you incorporate elements of the male gaze? Can you intentionally use the male gaze in a movie and subvert it at the same time? And the male gaze is so prominent in the film industry because this is still such a male-dominated industry, especially behind the camera. I think one could argue that certain characteristics of the male gaze in filmmaking has become the standard to a degree in visual storytelling. And if that's the case, then subverting the male gaze would be as simple as just subverting the standards of like Western storytelling. I think what Coralie Farjah is doing specifically is pulling back the curtain to the male gaze in film form and asking us to reconcile with that subverting of it. I think the way she satirizes the male gaze is in fact subverting it. And I think there's many ways you could go about subverting the male gaze. There are discussions online of people talking about the feminine gaze and what that means and what that looks like in film. Some people argue that simply by making femme characters well thought out beings in the story where their only purpose isn't to further a man's character arc is in itself subverting the male gaze. So by deliberately making a movie that utilizes aspects of the male gaze like Revenge, or just completely satirizes it like The Substance, is a solid punch upwards. So I guess ultimately my answer is yes. Yes, we can subvert the male gaze. And I hope with movies like The Substance getting some recognition at the Oscars, at least by the way of nominations, might help these stories be more prominent in the future. Maybe we can, maybe the male gaze could be a thing of the past soon. I don't know. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think that Coralie Farjah successfully subverts the male gaze in these two movies? Why or why not? There are a lot of new horror movies coming out this month, so expect a lot more movie reviews this month than videos like this, I think. But I will see you later this week with a review of The Rule of Jenny Penn, which comes out this weekend in theaters before it hits Shudder later on in the month. So until then, stay strange and take care of yourself.